In 1967, Phyllis Dillon was the undisputed Queen of Rocksteady. Her music generated millions of dollars. But behind the deceitful glamour of Jamaica lay a ruthless musical sweatshop, a place where she was forced to sing the sweetest love songs under the threat of a loaded shotgun. Robbed of all her rights by a heavily armed studio kingpin, she had a shattering realization. Her crown was a death sentence. To save herself from starvation and absolute control, Phyllis dethroned herself. She fled to New York, buried her identity, and spent the rest of her life as an anonymous bank teller. The system had successfully destroyed its own queen. She was not born into the hustle of the capital city. She was not a street-hardened teenager who understood the cutthroat mechanics of the Kingston ghettos. Phyllis was born in 1944 in Linstead, a small, vibrant agricultural town situated in the parish of St. Catherine. Linstead was famous for its bustling market, a place defined by the rhythmic, predictable cycles of rural life. For a young girl growing up in this environment, the world was small, communal, and relatively safe. Her earliest relationship with music was forged not in dingy nightclubs, but in the sacred, protective confines of the church and the structured environment of school choirs. In the Caribbean during the 1940s and 1950s, the church was the primary sanctioned outlet for female expression. It was a place where a woman's voice could be raised in power without drawing the predatory gaze of the secular world. When Phyllis sang hymns, her voice revealed itself as a natural phenomenon. It was not manufactured by vocal coaches or manipulated by studio engineers. It possessed an innate velvety richness, a profound emotional depth that commanded immediate attention. She sang for the pure, unadulterated joy of the melody. She understood the spiritual power of her voice, but she had absolutely no concept of its commercial value. She was completely ignorant of the mechanisms of publishing rights, mechanical royalties, distribution deals, or the predatory nature of men who viewed raw talent as a natural resource waiting to be mined. Her rural upbringing provided her with a strong moral compass, but it left her critically unequipped to navigate a world where morality was entirely absent. While Phyllis was growing up in the relative safety of Linstead, the social and political landscape of Jamaica was undergoing a violent, seismic shift. In 1962, the island gained independence from British colonial rule. This sudden transition created a vacuum of power, economic instability, and a massive migration of rural populations into the capital city of Kingston in search of work. The ghettos of West Kingston swelled. In this environment of extreme poverty and political tension, music became the ultimate currency. But this was not live band music played in polite concert halls. This was the era of the sound system. The sound system culture was the foundation of the Jamaican music industry. It was built around massive, custom-built speaker rigs that blasted rhythm and blues, ska, and eventually rocksteady into the Kingston nights. The men who owned these sound systems were not just DJs, they were kingpins. Men like Clement Coxone, Dodd, and Arthur Duke Reid commanded fierce gang-like loyalty from their followers. They battled for territorial supremacy in the streets, often using physical violence to sabotage rival dances. To feed their massive speakers, these men built their own recording studios, pressing exclusive vinyl records, known as dub plates, to ensure their sound system had music no one else possessed. This environment was an exclusive, hyper-masculine arena. The Kingston music scene of the mid-1960s was a patriarchal shark tank. Every lever of power, from the studio ownership to the distribution networks, from the session musicians to the street enforcers, was controlled by men. Women were largely relegated to the roles of fans, dancers, or romantic conquests. The very few female artists who attempted to enter the recording booths were treated with open condescension or viewed purely as novelties. There was zero protective infrastructure for young women. There were no female managers to advocate for them, no entertainment lawyers to read the fine print, and a prevailing cultural expectation of total female submission to male authority. To be a woman stepping into this arena was to step onto a battlefield without armor. It was against this dangerous backdrop that the trap of opportunity was set. By 1965, Phyllis Dillon was a 21-year-old woman singing at a local club, performing covers of American rhythm and blues hits. Her talent was simply too massive to remain hidden in St. Catherine. One evening, her voice caught the ear of Lynn Tate, a Trinidadian-born guitarist who was a highly respected foundational figure in the development of ska and rocksteady. Tate was mesmerizingly talented, a central figure in the Kingston studio system. When he heard the smooth, romantic cadence of Phyllis's voice, he immediately recognized its immense commercial potential. He approached the young singer and offered her an invitation that would alter the trajectory of her life forever. He told her she needed to come to Kingston to record. To a naive girl from Linstead, this invitation sounded like salvation. It sounded like the legitimate beginning of a professional career. She imagined entering a structured industry, one that operated with contracts, representation, and professional courtesy. She packed her bags with the optimism of youth, believing she was stepping onto an escalator of opportunity. She did not realize she was stepping onto a trapdoor. The journey from Linstead to Kingston was not just a geographic relocation, it was a profound psychological dislocation. As she arrived in the capital, the sensory overload was immediate. The polite, predictable rhythms of her hometown were replaced by the aggressive, chaotic hustle of the city. The heat radiating off the concrete, the heavy bass thumping from passing sound trucks, the sharp, appraising stares of the men on the corners. It was a world that operated on an entirely different frequency. She had arrived in the city completely alone. She had no family there to shelter her, no legal guardian to review the terms of her engagement, and no financial safety net to allow her to walk away if things felt wrong. Her rural innocence, the very quality that gave her voice its pure, angelic resonance, was the exact vulnerability that the system required to exploit her. She believed she was being brought to Kingston to be nurtured as an artist. The devastating reality was that she had been scouted, evaluated, and delivered into the hands of an unregulated underworld. The men waiting for her did not view her as a collaborator. They viewed her as raw material. They understood that a young, unprotected woman without legal representation or male guardianship was the easiest target in the world. They could take everything she created, offer her pennies in return, and rely on her fear and isolation to ensure her silence. When we think of a recording studio, we visualize soundproofed walls, sterile acoustic foam, reception desks, and an environment meticulously engineered to nurture the creative spirit. The destination that awaited the 21-year-old girl from Linstead was the exact antithesis of this corporate fantasy. She had been summoned to 33 Bond Street, located in the sweltering, unforgiving heart of downtown Kingston. This was the headquarters of Treasure Isle, a name that would become synonymous with the golden era of rocksteady music. But Treasure Isle was not a standalone sanctuary for artists. It was a makeshift wooden structure built directly above a bustling, chaotic liquor store. The liquor store was the financial engine and the social nucleus of the operation. It was a place where the hard realities of Kingston street life converged. Men gathered here to drink white rum, to argue over sound system clashes, and to conduct the illicit business of the ghetto. The air was perpetually thick with the sharp, medicinal stench of spilled alcohol, the heavy, pungent cloud of marijuana smoke, and the aggressive sweat of street enforcers who lingered on the pavement to protect the territory. To reach the recording studio, Phyllis had to physically push her way through this gauntlet of hardened men, absorbing their stares and their commentary before climbing a narrow, creaking set of wooden stairs. Every step she took upward was a step further away from the safety of her rural upbringing and deeper into an entirely unregulated, hyper-masculine stronghold. Waiting for her at the top of those stairs was the architect of this empire, Arthur Duke Reid. To call Reid a record producer is a profound historical inaccuracy. Reid was a warlord. Before he built his sound system and his studio, Reid had served for a decade as a police officer in the Jamaican constabulary. He was a man intimately familiar with the application of state-sanctioned force. He understood exactly how the law operated, which meant he knew exactly how to operate outside of it with absolute impunity. When he left the police force to run his liquor business and his sound system, he did not leave his authority behind. He simply transferred it to the streets. He ran Treasure Isle with the heavy-handed, paranoid menace of a mafia don. Reid utilized physical space and visual terror to assert immediate, unquestionable control over everyone who entered his domain. He did not sit quietly behind a mixing console taking notes with a pencil, allowing the musicians to dictate the creative flow. He actively patrolled the wooden floors of the studio. He was a massive, imposing figure, and he deliberately dressed to amplify his capacity for extreme violence. While the studio musicians tuned their instruments, Reid actively patrolled the room with firearms prominently displayed. This was not theatrical intimidation. These were functional weapons, and Reid had a legendary reputation for using them. If a recording take was going poorly, or if a musician played a wrong chord, Reid was known to draw his weapon and fire live rounds directly into the wooden ceiling, sending plaster and deafening echoes raining down on the terrified band. If a recording take was going poorly, or if a musician played a wrong chord, Reid was known to draw his revolver and fire live rounds directly into the wooden ceiling, sending plaster and deafening echoes raining down on the terrified band. This environment was a masterclass in psychological subjugation. The anatomy of intimidation relies on the constant, unspoken promise of violence. Reid did not have to point his shotgun directly at a singer to enforce compliance. The sheer proximity of the weapon did the work for him. The studio itself became a pressure cooker of fear. Because the building was wooden and situated above a noisy street, the recording conditions were rudimentary. The studio doors had to be locked and the windows bolted shut to keep out the sounds of the traffic and the liquor store below. In the oppressive tropical heat of Jamaica, without modern air conditioning, the room became a sweltering, suffocating box. The musicians were trapped inside a literal oven with a heavily armed, unpredictable dictator. For the veteran male musicians of Kingston, men like the legendary saxophonist Tommy McCook or singer Alton Ellis, Reid's intimidation tactics were terrifying, but they were a known quantity. These men had grown up in the tough neighborhoods of Trenchtown and Jonestown. They understood the language of the streets. Furthermore, they had the protective buffer of male camaraderie. They were backed by their bandmates, their brothers, and their street reputations. They could rely on the collective strength of the group to absorb the psychological blows of Reid's explosive temper. For Phyllis Dillon, the power imbalance was catastrophic. The gender dynamics of Treasure Isle amplified the terror to a paralyzing degree. She was a young woman in her early 20s, entirely isolated in a room filled with armed, aggressive men. The patriarchal structure of Jamaican society in the 1960s dictated that a woman without a male protector was essentially public property. Phyllis had no manager to negotiate on her behalf. She had no entertainment lawyer to review the terms of her presence. She had no father, brother, or husband standing in the corner of the room to defend her honor. She was utterly alone. When the heavy wooden door of the studio clicked shut, isolating her from the outside world, the reality of her vulnerability settled over her like a suffocating blanket. If Duke Reid decided to lock the door and refuse her exit, there was no human resources department to call. There was no police intervention to seek, because Reid himself represented the ultimate authority in that neighborhood. The local constabulary would never dare cross him. She was entirely at his mercy. The men in the studio were not going to risk their own lives or their livelihoods to intervene on behalf of a naive country girl. This profound isolation is the root of the trauma that would define the rest of her life. She realized, with the sudden sharp clarity of prey trapped in a snare, that the music industry she had dreamed of did not exist. There was no glamour here. There was no artistic collaboration. There was only raw, unmitigated power. She had been lured into a space where her physical safety, her dignity, and her voice were entirely subject to the whims of a man who measured his authority in bullets. She was a captive bird in a cage built of liquor, vinyl, and gun smoke. And as the studio engineer signaled that the tape was rolling, she was expected to open her mouth and sing as if her life depended on it. Because in that stifling, heavily armed room, it truly felt as though it did. The physical threat of Treasure Isle was absolute, but the most profound violence inflicted upon Phyllis Dillon was not physical, it was entirely psychological. If Duke Reid had demanded aggressive, angry, or confrontational music, the environment of the studio might have aligned with the output, but the Kingston music scene in the mid-1960s was undergoing a massive stylistic shift. The frantic, upbeat, horn-driven energy of ska was slowing down. The heat of the Jamaican summer of 1966, combined with the shifting tastes of the dance halls, gave birth to a new genre, rocksteady. Rocksteady was built on a heavy, syncopated bass line and a dramatically slower tempo. It was music designed for the dance hall, but specifically for close, intimate dancing. It was the music of lovers. Consequently, the genre demanded a very specific vocal delivery. It required singers to be exceptionally smooth, deeply emotional, and profoundly romantic. The vocals had to float effortlessly over the heavy rhythm section. To sing rocksteady successfully, an artist had to project vulnerability, tenderness, and a relaxed, soulful yearning. This was the commercial product that Duke Reid required to maintain his dominance over the rival sound systems. He needed love songs, and he expected a terrified 21-year-old girl, standing in a sweltering wooden box surrounded by armed men, to manufacture that feeling on command. This demand created a state of extreme cognitive dissonance, forming the core of Phyllis Dillon's enduring psychological trauma. Consider the physiological mechanics of fear. When a human being is trapped in a room with a volatile man holding a loaded shotgun, the autonomic nervous system triggers a primal fight or flight response. The body floods with adrenaline. The heart rate skyrockets. The muscles tense, particularly in the neck and shoulders. The breath becomes shallow and rapid, restricted to the upper chest as the body prepares for sudden physical exertion or violent trauma. The throat instinctively constricts to protect the airway. Now consider the physiological mechanics of elite vocal performance. To sing a song like Perfidia or Don't Stay Away with the flawless, velvety tone that would make Phyllis a global sensation, the body must do the exact opposite of what fear dictates. Elite singing requires absolute mastery of the diaphragm. It requires deep, slow, controlled breathing. The throat must be completely relaxed and open to allow the vocal cords to vibrate smoothly. The jaw must be loose and the mind must be focused entirely on pitch, phrasing, and emotional resonance. Phyllis Dillon was commanded to execute the physiology of love and relaxation while her body was screaming with the physiology of mortal terror. This is an impossible biological contradiction. A human being cannot simultaneously prepare for a bullet and deliver a lullaby. To bridge this impossible gap to survive the recording session and satisfy the armed dictator staring at her through the glass of the vocal booth, Phyllis had to employ a severe psychological defense mechanism. She had to dissociate. Dissociation is a psychological splitting of the mind, a survival tactic utilized by victims of extreme trauma when physical escape is impossible. If the body cannot leave the terrifying room, the mind must leave the body. As the studio engineer threaded the magnetic tape and the red recording light flickered on, Phyllis had to actively sever her consciousness from her immediate reality. She had to mentally detach from the smell of the rum, the heat of the room, and the visual of Duke Reid's Colt 45 revolvers. She had to retreat to a hidden, insulated corner of her own mind, perhaps returning to the safe, quiet church pews of Linstead, or perhaps retreating into a numb, protective void while leaving her physical vocal apparatus behind to do the work. This act of psychological splitting is an incredibly violent thing to do to oneself. It requires a person to actively ignore their own survival instincts. When the band laid down the heavy, swaying rocksteady groove, Phyllis stepped up to the microphone and opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was breathtakingly pure. It was calm, soothing, and perfectly pitched. It sounded like a woman entirely at peace, singing to a devoted lover in the dead of night. But that voice was a fabrication of necessity. It was a mask. Beneath that flawless vocal delivery, her nervous system was in a state of silent, screaming panic. She was forcing her constricted throat to open. She was fighting her own shallow, panicked breathing to draw the deep diaphragmatic air required to sustain the long, emotional notes. Every ounce of her internal energy was dedicated to maintaining the illusion of calm. She was packaging her own raw terror into sweet, digestible melodies for public consumption. Duke Reid did not care about the internal psychological warfare she was waging. He only cared that the magnetic tape was capturing a hit record. He listened to the playback, heard the romantic perfection in her voice, and assumed total ownership of the product. He fired his gun into the ceiling to signify a good take, completely blind to the fact that the gunshot only deepened the trauma required to produce the art. The long-term impact of this forced dissociation cannot be overstated. When an artist creates music in a safe environment, their songs become an extension of their identity. The music is a reflection of their soul. But for Phyllis, the music became a monument to her subjugation. Her greatest artistic triumphs, the songs that would define a generation in Jamaica and trigger a cultural revolution among the youth in Great Britain, were recorded during the moments of her greatest psychological terror. Her voice became a commodity that was entirely detached from her internal reality. This is the cruelest irony of the Kingston studio system. The public consumed her pain disguised as pleasure. When teenagers in London or Kingston put a Phyllis Dillon record on the turntable, they heard romance. They closed their eyes, swayed to the bass line, and felt the warmth of her delivery. They had absolutely no idea that they were listening to the sound of a woman actively surviving a hostage situation. They were dancing to the rhythm of her dissociation. The system required her to be a vessel, a beautiful instrument played by ruthless men, and it demanded that she leave her humanity at the door. She executed this impossible task with a brilliance that cemented her status as the Queen of Rocksteady. She delivered hit after hit for Treasure Isle. She never missed a note. She never let her voice crack with the fear that was coursing through her veins. But the psychological bill for this constant splitting of the mind was accumulating. You cannot repeatedly sever your consciousness from your body without suffering a profound loss of self. She was surviving the studio, but the recording booth was systematically dismantling her identity. She was learning the darkest lesson of the music industry. Her immense God-given talent was not a tool for her own liberation. It was the very mechanism of her imprisonment. When the red recording light flickered off and the heavy, suffocating air of the Treasure Isle vocal booth finally began to circulate, the immediate physical threat to Phyllis Dillon subsided. She had survived the session. She had successfully compartmentalized her terror, delivering the flawless, romantic, rock-steady vocals that Duke Reid demanded. But as the adrenaline drained from her system, leaving her exhausted and hollowed out, a new, far more insidious machinery of exploitation engaged. The physical intimidation she endured in the studio was merely the blunt instrument used to enforce compliance. The true violence of the Kingston music industry was economic, executed with a cold, administrative precision that ensured her permanent subjugation. Duke Reid did not simply want to control her voice in the moment, he intended to own it in perpetuity. He achieved this not through the barrel of his shotgun, but through the weaponization of poverty and the manipulation of copyright law. The concept of artist royalties, publishing advances, or mechanical rights did not exist for the singers of West Kingston. The ecosystem operated on a predatory model known as the session fee system. This was an industry devoid of unions, standardized contracts, or basic labor protections. The producers held a total monopoly over the means of production, the studios, the pressing plants, and the sound systems. They dictated the terms of engagement with absolute, unchallenged authority. When Phyllis stepped out of the recording booth, having just laid down a vocal track that would soon become a foundational pillar of Jamaican musical history, she was not handed a recording contract detailing her percentage of future sales. She was handed a few crumpled Jamaican pounds. This flat cash payment was aggressively minuscule. It was a day rate barely sufficient to cover the cost of a week's groceries, a modest rent payment, or the bus fare back to Linstead. It was survival money. The producers understood the exact mathematics of desperation. They knew that the young artists walking up the stairs to their studios were often impoverished, hungry, and desperate for immediate cash relief. By keeping the session fees deliberately low, men like Duke Reid ensured that the musicians remained in a perpetual state of financial dependency. If Phyllis wanted to eat next week, she would have to return to the studio, face the armed dictator, and record another song for another fistful of coins. The system was meticulously designed to function as an economic treadmill, preventing the artist from ever accumulating enough capital to assert their independence or negotiate better terms. But the session fee was not merely an underpayment. It was the bait for a much larger, permanent trap. When Phyllis accepted those few pounds to secure her immediate biological survival, the transaction did not end there. She was then coerced into signing a piece of paper that would legally erase her from the financial history of her own creation. This document was the buyout agreement. In the shadowy, smoke-filled office of Treasure Isle, under the heavy appraising stare of a man with a loaded weapon, Phyllis Dillon was instructed to sign her name. There was no time to read the document. There was no legal counsel available to explain its devastating implications. Refusing to sign meant forfeiting the day's pay she desperately needed, and potentially provoking the explosive temper of a former police officer who operated above the law. By signing that single sheet of paper, Phyllis executed a total transfer of ownership. She legally surrendered 100% of her publishing rights, her writing credits, and the exclusive ownership of the master recordings. The buyout agreement stated that for the sum of the session fee, she relinquished any and all future claims to the commercial exploitation of the song. In the eyes of the law, Duke Reid was no longer just the producer. He was the sole owner of the intellectual property. He had successfully purchased the legal rights to her breath, her phrasing, and her soul for the price of a cheap meal. This is the point where street-level extortion seamlessly transitioned into corporate legitimacy. The buyout contract sanitized the violence of the studio. It transformed a product obtained under extreme psychological duress into a perfectly clean, legally defensible asset. Once Reid secured the master recordings and the ironclad paperwork to prove his ownership, the second phase of the theft commenced. The island of Jamaica, while culturally vibrant, was a small commercial market. The true financial windfall of the Rocksteady era lay across the Atlantic Ocean. During the late 1960s, the United Kingdom was experiencing a massive cultural shift. A booming population of working-class British youth, mods, skinheads, and early reggae enthusiasts were aggressively adopting Jamaican music as the soundtrack to their subcultures. Recognizing this explosive demand, British record labels, most notably Trojan Records, began to heavily license and import Jamaican master tapes. Duke Reid tapped directly into this lucrative UK pipeline. He shipped the master recordings of Phyllis Dillon's flawlessly delivered love songs to London. When tracks like Perfidia, Don't Stay Away, and Rocksteady hit the British shores, They caused an absolute sensation. The British youth were captivated by the smooth, yearning quality of her voice. Her records were pressed by the tens of thousands. They dominated the turntables of massive underground clubs in London, Birmingham, and Manchester. They climbed the UK charts, generating substantial, undeniable revenue. The music was transitioning from the dusty sound system dances of Kingston to the massive, highly monetized infrastructure of the European music market. The financial scale of this success was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of British pounds were flowing through the distribution networks, filling the bank accounts of the British label executives and the Jamaican producers who held the licenses. But because of the buyout contract signed in the oppressive heat of Treasure Isle, this river of wealth entirely bypassed the woman whose voice had generated it. The legal architecture of the theft functioned flawlessly. When a European distributor pressed a Phyllis Dillon record and sold it to a teenager in London, they owed Duke Reid a licensing fee. They owed the British pressing plant a manufacturing fee, but they owed Phyllis Dillon absolutely nothing. This is the chilling reality of how the global music industry laundered the extortion of the developing world. The executives sitting in air-conditioned boardrooms in London did not need to know, nor did they care about the conditions under which the music was recorded. They did not care about the shotgun, the psychological splitting, or the desperate poverty of the singer. They only cared that the paperwork was in order. The buyout agreement functioned as a legal firewall, protecting the corporations from the moral rot at the origin of the product. They could legally, ethically, and profitably exploit her talent because the extortion had been formalized by her signature. For Phyllis, the realization of this theft did not happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping dawn of humiliation. As 1966 turned into 1967, she began to grasp the monumental scale of her own erasure. She was not just a local singer anymore. She was an international commodity. Yet her personal reality remained tethered to the grim economics of the session fee. She was generating empires of wealth for men on 2 different continents, while she struggled to afford the basic necessities of life in Jamaica. The system had successfully extracted her genius, monetized it on a global scale, and left her with the financial equivalent of scrap metal. She had been robbed in broad daylight, using a pen instead of a pistol, and the entire legal framework of the international music business was actively enforcing the theft. The most devastating tragedies in the entertainment industry rarely occur during a period of decline. When an artist's popularity fades, the resulting financial struggle is at least logical. It follows the ruthless, predictable laws of supply and demand. The true horror of Phyllis Dillon's story is rooted in the timing of her destruction. She did not walk away from the Jamaican music scene because the public lost interest in her voice. She did not fade into obscurity because a new generation of singers pushed her off the charts. She was forced into exile at the absolute undeniable zenith of her success. To understand the profound psychological breaking point that drove her out of her own country, we must examine the agonizing paradox she lived every single day in 1967. This was the year Rocksteady completely conquered the island, and Phyllis Dillon was its undisputed reigning queen. Her departure was not a career pivot. It was an emergency evacuation from a system that was actively starving her to death in broad daylight. By 1967, the cultural landscape of Kingston was entirely saturated with her sound. You could not walk down a street, take a bus, or pass a local rum bar without hearing her pristine, velvety vocals cutting through the heavy, humid air. The sound systems that dominated the neighborhoods of West Kingston blasted her hit singles deep into the early hours of the morning. Songs like Don't Stay Away had transcended mere popularity. They had become the emotional soundtrack for an entire generation of Jamaicans, navigating love, heartbreak, and the harsh realities of post-independence life. Her voice was an inescapable, monumental presence. For the average Jamaican citizen, Phyllis Dillon was a superstar of the highest order. They looked at the massive popularity of her records. They saw the sheer volume of vinyl being moved across the island and exported to the United Kingdom. And they made the natural, logical assumption: Phyllis Dillon must be incredibly wealthy. This assumption created a daily, inescapable nightmare for the young woman from Linstead. The psychological burden of extreme fame is heavy enough, but when that fame is coupled with extreme hidden poverty, it becomes a uniquely corrosive form of torture. Phyllis was living a split existence that was tearing her identity apart. On the radio, she was a goddess. In reality, she was a 23-year-old woman walking the cracked pavements of Kingston with empty pockets. Because Duke Reid had secured complete ownership of her master recordings and publishing rights through the predatory session fee system, the monumental success of her songs yielded absolutely no financial dividends for her. The royalties generated by her voice were buying land, luxury cars, and expanding empires for the men who controlled the studio. Meanwhile, the woman whose breath built those empires was struggling to afford basic living expenses. The daily humiliation of this paradox was relentless. Imagine the psychological toll of standing at a market stall trying to carefully calculate if you have enough copper coins to purchase a modest meal, while a transistor radio on the very same counter is broadcasting your voice to the nation. Imagine the indignity of neighbors, fans, and acquaintances treating you with a reverence reserved for a millionaire, asking for favors or financial assistance, completely unaware that you are quietly drowning in poverty. She could not tell them the truth. To admit that she was penniless would be to admit that she had been utterly bested, manipulated, and robbed by the industry she loved. It would require exposing the humiliating reality that the Queen of Rocksteady was essentially an indentured servant to a man with a shotgun. This environment forced Phyllis into a state of profound social isolation. She could not participate in the lifestyle that her public image demanded. She could not afford the trappings of success, the clothes, or the security that should have accompanied her level of fame. Every time she stepped out of her door, she had to perform a secondary act of dissociation, pretending to be the comfortable, successful artist everyone believed her to be, while suppressing the panic of her actual financial destitution. She was trapped in a hall of mirrors where her own reflection mocked her. Her voice was everywhere, but her agency was non-existent. The music industry had not just stolen her money. It had stolen her ability to exist honestly in her own community. As 1967 progressed, the crushing weight of this reality brought her to a stark, terrifying realization. The Jamaican music industry was not a meritocracy. Hard work, generational talent, and massive public adoration did not equal financial security. The system was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It was an extraction economy built to strip mine the raw talent of the lower classes and funnel the profits exclusively to the top. Duke Reid and the other producers were never going to change the rules. They were never going to suddenly offer her a fair contract out of a sense of moral obligation. Their entire business model relied on her perpetual desperation. She realized that if she stayed in Kingston, if she continued to walk up those wooden stairs to Treasure Isle to sing for a handful of Jamaican pounds, she would eventually be destroyed. She would be bled dry until her voice faltered, at which point she would be discarded entirely. This is the exact moment the breaking point occurred. It was a cold mathematical calculation made by a woman who realized that her passion was lethal. She loved singing. It was her God-given gift, the very core of her identity since her days in the church choir in Linstead. But she recognized that the men who controlled the microphones had turned her gift into a weapon against her. She could not consume her own fame. Applause could not pay her rent. Standing ovations could not put food on her table. To ensure her basic biological survival, she had to make the most agonizing decision of her life. She had to kill the artist to save the woman. Phyllis Dillon made the choice to walk away from the microphone at the exact moment she was the most powerful, though. Cow Force in the Caribbean. She did not seek out a new producer. She did not attempt to negotiate a better deal with a rival studio because she correctly understood that the entire infrastructure was corrupt. Instead, she chose total, absolute exile. She packed her few belongings, turned her back on the island that worshipped her voice but refused to pay her for it, and purchased a ticket to the United States. Fleeing to New York was not a strategic career move. When a successful musician moves to America, it is usually an aggressive expansion, an attempt to break into the largest commercial market in the world. For Phyllis Dillon, the flight to New York was an emergency evacuation. She was not traveling to America to secure a record deal with a major label or to book a tour across the continent. She was traveling to America to disappear. She was migrating to find a regular, anonymous, working-class job that would pay her a predictable, legally protected wage. She was trading the crown of Rocksteady for the invisibility of the immigrant working class. The psychological grief of this decision is difficult to articulate. She was willingly silencing herself. She was stepping off the stage and walking into the shadows, fully aware that the empire Duke Reid built on her back would continue to generate massive wealth without her. As her plane lifted off the tarmac, leaving the heat of Kingston behind, she carried with her a trauma that few people will ever understand. She had survived the architecture of terror in the recording booth. She had survived the brutal mechanics of the buyout contracts. But to survive the ultimate humiliation of being famous and starving, she had to abandon the only thing she truly loved. She landed in New York not as a conquering star, but as a refugee fleeing an industry that had systematically consumed her youth and stolen her future. When an immigrant steps off a plane in New York City, they are usually looking for a blank slate. They are seeking the anonymity of the metropolis, a place where the past can be cleanly severed and a new pragmatic future can be built from the ground up. For Phyllis Dillon, arriving in America at the tail end of the 1960s was an exercise in profound, deliberate self-erasure. She had not come to New York to conquer its legendary music scene or to find a new record label. She had come to find a time clock to punch. The woman who possessed the most coveted voice in the Caribbean traded the humid, music-soaked air of Kingston for the brutal, unforgiving concrete of the American working class. She needed a mechanism for survival that did not require her to surrender her psychological safety to men with weapons. She found that survival in the highly structured, anonymous, and heavily regulated environment of a retail bank. Phyllis secured a job as a bank teller. This career choice presents one of the most agonizing, hard-hitting ironies in the history of modern music. Every single day she put on a standard conservative uniform. She stood behind a pane of thick, bulletproof glass, a cruel, unintended visual echo of the recording booth, glass at Treasure Isle. But instead of staring out at Duke Reid and his shotgun, she was staring at the tired faces of ordinary New Yorkers. For 8 hours a day, her physical reality consisted of standing on her aching feet, processing deposits, and counting stacks of cash that belonged to other people. She was meticulously balancing ledgers for a massive financial institution, ensuring every single cent was accounted for, while a multi-million-pound empire built entirely on her own stolen intellectual property was operating unchecked across the Atlantic Ocean. To survive the shift from international superstar to anonymous bank teller, Phyllis had to construct a fortress of silence around her past. She settled in a neighborhood with a heavy Jamaican immigrant population. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Caribbean diaspora in boroughs like Brooklyn and the Bronx was expanding rapidly. The immigrants brought their culture, their food, and most importantly, their music with them. This meant that Phyllis Dillon could never truly escape the ghost of her own genius. The system had stolen her money, but the culture refused to let her voice die. Imagine the visceral daily torture of her routine. She would walk to the subway or step into a local grocery store, and her own voice would suddenly drift out of a passing car window or boom from a neighborhood sound system. Tracks like Perfidia and Right Track were not just nostalgic hits, they were foundational anthems of the Jamaican identity. People at block parties just down the street from her apartment were falling in love, dancing and weeping to the very song she had recorded in a state of sheer terror. Her voice was the connective tissue for a displaced community. Yet when she stood in line at the bakery, or when she sat in the break room at the bank, she never said a word. She never leaned over to a coworker and said, "That's me on the radio." The silence was not born of humility. It was a byproduct of profound humiliation. Victims of extreme financial and psychological abuse frequently carry the shame that rightfully belongs to their abusers. If Phyllis had revealed her true identity to her coworkers or her neighbors, the immediate logical follow-up question would have been devastating. If you are the Queen of Rocksteady, why are you standing here cashing my check? Why are you taking the subway? Where is your mansion? Answering those questions would require tearing open a psychological wound she was desperately trying to keep stitched shut. It would require her to explain the mechanics of the session fee scam to lay people who did not understand the predatory nature of the Jamaican music business. It would mean confessing that she had been intimidated, outsmarted, and legally stripped of her own creations by men who viewed her as disposable. It would mean admitting that the European record labels, the supposedly respectable corporate entities pressing her vinyl in London, were actively participating in her exploitation by hiding behind fraudulent buyout contracts. Explaining this complex architecture of theft to a bank manager or a neighborhood friend was simply too heavy a burden. The humiliation of being a starving legend was a private agony. She decided it was easier and safer to let the world believe Phyllis Dillon was a distant, untouchable star, while the real Phyllis Dillon quietly counted the drawer at register number 4. This is the ultimate cruelty of the extractive music industry. It does not just steal an artist's wealth, it steals their right to claim their own history. The corporations rely entirely on this shame to maintain the status quo. The executives at Trojan Records in the UK did not have to worry about the optics of exploiting a young Jamaican woman, because the young Jamaican woman was too deeply traumatized and humiliated to launch a public relations war against them. Her silence was the grease that kept the wheels of their distribution machinery turning flawlessly. As the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the rocksteady and reggae genres saw massive global resurgences. British bands like the Specials and UB40 were heavily influenced by the very tracks Phyllis had recorded. Her music was being repackaged, repressed on compilation albums, and sold to entirely new generations of fans. The revenue streams were regenerating, compounding, and expanding. And through it all, Phyllis remained a ghost. The days turned into years, and the years calcified into decades. She aged out of her 20s through her 30s and into her 40s, standing on the hard floors of the bank. The physical toll of the job began to set in, the aching back, the swollen joints, the standard biological receipts of the working class. She raised a family, providing for them through the honest, grinding labor of the American system. She was an exemplary worker, a dedicated mother, and a pillar of her local community. But inside, she was a woman holding a staggering secret. The psychological discipline required to maintain this facade for over 25 years is almost incomprehensible. It requires a daily active suppression of the ego. Every time a royalty check was diverted to a corporate account in London instead of her mailbox in New York, the industry committed a fresh act of violence against her. She was forced to be a passive spectator to her own legacy. She watched the world dance to her stolen breath. She watched European executives build generational wealth for their children, using the love song she had sung while staring down the barrel of Duke Reid's shotgun. She bore the isolation completely alone, a phantom operating in the margins of a city that never sleeps, while her voice echoed eternally across the oceans. Time is the ultimate auditor of buried truths. A corporation can legally launder a stolen asset, and a traumatized victim can successfully hide in the sprawling anonymity of a foreign city, but cultural impact cannot be permanently suppressed. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the global music landscape experienced a profound retroactive shift. A massive ska and rocksteady revival swept across Europe, the United Kingdom, and Japan. A new generation of obsessive record collectors, music historians, and younger musicians began digging fiercely into the archives of the 1960s Jamaican sound. They were tracing the roots of modern reggae and punk back to its foundational pillars. And at the absolute center of this historical excavation stood the pristine, unshakable voice of Phyllis Dillon. Her original vinyl pressings on the Treasure Isle and Trojan labels became highly sought after, expensive collector's items. The demand to hear the Queen of Rocksteady reached a fever pitch. The global underground music community mobilized following decades-old paper, trails, and community whispers. Eventually, the search bypassed the decaying recording studios of Kingston, crossed the Atlantic, and stopped at the counter of a retail bank in New York City. The ghost had been found. For Phyllis, the moment of discovery was a violent collision of two completely segregated lives. For over 2 decades, she had meticulously maintained the wall between the traumatized girl who fled Jamaica and the pragmatic, hard-working woman counting currency in America. To suddenly have music promoters and journalists knocking on her door was not a simple invitation. It was a demand to reopen a locked psychological vault. Stepping back onto a stage required her to directly confront the source of her deepest humiliation. It meant re-engaging with an industry that had previously stripped her of her dignity and her wealth. Yet, the persistent adoration of the fans offered something she had never experienced in Duke Reid's studio: respect. After immense deliberation, she made the courageous decision to unearth her voice. In the early 1990s, Phyllis Dillon officially stepped out of her self-imposed exile. The return was nothing short of triumphant. She was booked as a headlining act at massive specialized music festivals across the United Kingdom, Germany, and Japan. When she walked out under the stage lights, the reaction was seismic. She stood before seas of tens of thousands of people who knew every single lyric to songs she had recorded over 30 years prior. Grown men and women wept openly as she delivered flawlessly preserved renditions of Perfidia and Right Track. For the first time in her entire life, she was not singing into a microphone, while a former police officer glared at her with a shotgun. She was singing to an audience that was projecting pure, unadulterated gratitude back at her. The standing ovations lasted for minutes on end. This delayed validation was profoundly healing. It provided physical, undeniable proof that she was not crazy, that her talent was genuinely generational, and that the sacrifice of her youth had actually meant something to the world. However, emotional validation is not financial equity. The live performances, while deeply gratifying to her soul, functioned as a cruel systemic band-aid over a fatal economic wound. The brutal reality of her comeback was that the fundamental architecture of her exploitation remained entirely intact. The promoters were paying her a performance fee to sing at these festivals. But the underlying multi-million-dollar catalog of her master recordings and publishing rights, the actual regenerating wealth of her career, remained firmly locked in the vaults of the European record labels and corporate holding companies. By the 1990s, the rights to the Treasure Isle catalog had changed hands, been bought out, and integrated into larger corporate portfolios. These companies viewed Phyllis Dillon's master recordings as highly lucrative real estate. They were generating steady, reliable passive income through reissues, compilation albums, and licensing deals. When Phyllis reemerged, the corporations were thrilled because her live tours functioned as free marketing that drove up the sales of the very records they owned. But when the subject of returning her publishing rights or paying retroactive royalties was broached, the corporate doors slammed shut. The executives running these labels were not operating out of personal malice. They were operating on the cold, institutional logic of systemic preservation. They knew perfectly well that the original 1960s buyout contracts signed in Duke Reid's studio were obtained under extreme psychological duress, without legal representation, and for aggressively substandard compensation. But to voluntarily admit that, and to return the rights to Phyllis Dillon, would set a catastrophic legal precedent. It would open the floodgates for hundreds of other exploited Jamaican artists to demand their stolen catalog, EES, back. The entire foundation of the label's profitability would collapse. Therefore, the corporate strategy was total stonewalling. They hid behind the 50-year-old fraudulent paperwork, legally sanitizing the extortion of the past to protect the profits of the present. They treated Phyllis Dillon not as the rightful owner of her own voice, but as a historical novelty act who should simply be grateful for the opportunity to tour. The sheer insult of this dynamic finally shattered the remaining vestiges of Phyllis's passive compliance. The standing ovations in Tokyo and London had restored her self-worth. She was no longer the terrified 21-year-old girl, isolated in a sweltering room in Kingston. She was a grown woman, a hardened New Yorker who understood the value of her labor. In the early 2000s, Phyllis Dillon decided to go to war. She began the arduous, highly complex process of securing aggressive legal representation to officially challenge the validity of the 1960s contracts and fight for the restitution of her stolen royalties. She was preparing to drag the corporations into the light and force them to answer for the mechanics of their theft. Then, the universe delivered its ultimate, unfathomable cruelty. Just as the legal machinery was finally beginning to gain traction, biology intervened. Phyllis Dillon was diagnosed with cancer. The timing was a devastating, almost literary tragedy. The moment she finally possessed the psychological armor and the legal backing to fight the systemic disease of the music industry, she was forced to divert all her energy to fighting a literal disease invading her own body. The priorities instantly shifted. Depositions, contract reviews, and royalty audits were suddenly completely overshadowed by chemotherapy, hospital visits, and the desperate, grueling battle for her physical survival. The corporate lawyers defending the record labels understood exactly what this diagnosis meant. In the realm of high-stakes entertainment litigation, corporate defense strategies often rely on a tactic known as a war of attrition. If a plaintiff does not have massive financial reserves, the corporation will deliberately stall. They will file endless motions, request unnecessary discovery, and drag the proceedings out for years, deliberately bleeding the plaintiff dry through mounting legal fees until they are forced to settle or drop the case. When the plaintiff is diagnosed with a terminal illness, the corporate strategy simply shifts to running out the biological clock. The industry stalled her. They refused to expedite settlements. They refused to acknowledge the moral urgency of a dying woman simply asking for the rights to her own life's work. They entrenched themselves behind their legal firewalls and waited. They knew that if she died before the legal battles could be decisively won, the momentum of the lawsuits would severely fracture, and the copyrights would remain safely within their corporate portfolios. They were right. The cancer was aggressive. Her death on April 15, 2004, at the age of 59, represents the final bitter insult in a lifetime defined by extraction. The industry successfully stalled her legal fight until she was in the ground, ensuring that the men who originally robbed her at gunpoint and the corporate executives who laundered that theft kept the money and the masters. Phyllis Dillon was forced to trade the crown of Rocksteady for the invisibility of a bank teller just to survive. Yet her pristine, velvety voice remains a monument to human endurance. She was not merely singing love songs. She was actively surviving, leaving behind a legacy that the machine could steal but never replicate.